Good evening, everybody. Thank you for joining us tonight for the Air Quality Enforcement Informational Session on Cleveland Cliffs Steel Corporation. My name is Caitlin DeVries, and I am from EGLE's Environmental Support Division, and I'll be primarily running the background here tonight. But before we begin, and I pass it over to tonight's moderator, I want to cover a few quick housekeeping items. So first off, all lines will be muted for tonight's meeting. There will be an opportunity for questions, and we'll tell you how you'll be able to ask those questions here in a minute. And lastly, we are recording tonight's meeting, and we will be posting this meeting to our website as well as sharing it out via email to everybody who's registered or attended this meeting. So with that housekeeping out of the way, I'm going to pass it over to tonight's moderator, Jennifer Dixon. So Jennifer, go ahead whenever you're ready.
Hey, Caitlin, thanks a lot. I really appreciate it. I'm Jennifer Dixon, and I'm going to be moderating tonight, like Caitlin said. We have a lot of panelists on tonight, and we're really excited to finally be able to bring this action in front of everybody. So really happy that folks have taken the time out of their evening to join us. Couple other things to go over from a housekeeping perspective. Like Caitlin mentioned, we are going to have a question and answer session at the end of the presentation today, and I'll talk a little bit more about what the agenda is going to look like in a second. But I want folks just to kind of keep in mind that if you have questions as we go along, you can feel free to put them in that question and answer box at the bottom of your screen. Once we get to the question and answer part of the evening, you will be able to raise your hand and verbally ask a question. So you can do that by clicking that raise hand icon at the bottom of the screen. Or if we do have folks calling in, and I'll remind everybody of this later as well, you can type 2 into your phone and that will raise your hand for us as well. So want to just quickly go over a few things. So like I said, we have a lot of panelists on with us tonight, and it's just because this action was pretty complicated and there's a lot of players involved. So if my panelists would like to turn their cameras on, they can. I know we've got some folks that can't turn their cameras on tonight, which is no problem, but I'm just going to run through, introduce everybody really quickly. You'll be reintroduced to them as we go through the presentation tonight, and then you'll be reintroduced to them probably again when we go into the question and answer session. So the first person that I want to introduce is Elizabeth Loeb, and she's with the Federal Department of Justice. So she's one of the attorneys that worked on this case. We also have Elizabeth Morisseau. She's from our state Department of Attorney General's office. She's another attorney that worked with us. We have Patrick Miller from the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, an engineer on this project. I've got a couple folks besides Caitlin and I from the Michigan Department of Environment, Great Lakes and Energy, and that is Katie Koster. She is the inspector for Cleveland Cliffs. And Jason Wolf, he is the enforcement specialist on this project here at EGLE. And we're also really lucky to have a couple folks from the Concerned Citizens of South Dearborn on with us as well. And that is going to be Samra Lukman and Karima Alwasha. And you're going to be hearing from Karima at least later. And Samra is also going to be on to answer some questions. They're going to be talking about a very particular part of this project called the Supplemental Environmental Project. So we'll talk about that more later, but I wanted to just make sure you knew that all these folks were on the line tonight to give you some information and hopefully be able to answer some of your questions. So another thing that I really want to mention before we get started is that this is not a hearing. I just want to make sure that everybody knows this isn't a hearing. It's just an informational session where we're going to, like I said, give you some information about this enforcement action, and then we'll answer any questions. We will make sure to tell you about how you can provide comments to the Department of Justice. It's a little different than how we do it at EGLE, so they have a couple ways that you can give them comments, and we'll talk about those a little bit later as well. So panelists, if you guys want to turn your cameras off, except Liz, I think we're getting to you first, so if you want to leave yours on, go ahead. So the way we're going to do this is we're going to talk a little bit about the overview of this modification to this consent decree. And if some of these words sound a little weird, don't worry about it. We will talk a little bit more about those later. We're going to talk about the background of the facility and the compliance history. We're going to talk about performance testing results. So what that is how we test the emissions, how we test the pollutants coming out of the stacks. It's also called stack testing. So you might be familiar with that, you might not. We're going to be talking about that in some detail. This is a very important part of this enforcement action. We're going to then talk about that supplemental environmental project with Samra and Karima. So that will be really good. And then we'll get into that question and answer. We'll talk to you after the question and answer session, just really quickly about how you can submit those comments. Like I said, some comments need to be submitted to the Department of Justice by November 29th. So it's a really important date, November 29th. So you have a few weeks after this information session to get those comments submitted as well. We'll talk about where you can find other information, and we'll also talk about who you can contact with additional questions that you might have. All right, so I'm going to turn my camera off and my microphone because we've done talking for a minute. And Liz, I'm going to pass it over to you. And if I don't change the slides when you need me to, just say next slide and I'll get it right over to you.
Okay, thanks so much. So I'm just going to give a very high level overview of what this modification is and the process by which it gets what we call entered by the court as a judicial order. So as many of you maybe know, there was a 2015 consent decree that addressed air emissions from the Dearborn plant, which was then run by AK Steel, now Cleveland Cliffs. And that was in effect, is still in effect. And during the time, the last few years, it was determined that it really wasn't enough to constrain the emissions in ways that were necessary to comply with federal and state law. So what this is that we have proposed is a modification of that consent decree. And the centerpiece of that modification is that they're going to rebuild the primary pollution control device, which is called an electrostatic precipitator, or ESP. And I said they're going to build. I should have said they have already built, because during negotiations, we had them start the building process. Negotiations took a bit longer than we anticipated, and they've actually finished that, and it's already running. The ESP controls emissions from the steelmaking operations, particularly visible emissions, particulate matter, including lead and manganese. So that is actually was completed over 6 months ago. The modification also requires enhanced monitoring of emissions so that we know that the new ESP is doing what it's designed to do. It also requires frequent performance testing to ensure that the ESP is working correctly. And then there's a supplemental environmental project that we'll be talking about a little bit later. And that's really something that the state is part of the state's, under state law, the settlement with the state. I think you can go to the next slide. Okay, so the process, a couple more things about before I get into the process that the modification provides. It provides for both EPA and EGLE oversight of the ongoing work, and particularly the performance testing and the modification. So it's not like the governments are going to just walk away and say, we're done. They're going to keep looking at reports that Cleveland Cliffs is required to submit and making sure that everything's proceeding as it should be proceeding in terms of emissions reductions and adhering to emissions limits. And if there is a problem, particularly, for instance, if Cleveland Cliffs doesn't comply with one of the requirements, be it a performance testing requirement, a monitoring requirement, or another requirement, the modification provides for penalties that we, the government, can assess to, encourage them to continue to comply. We also have the ability to go to the court and get another court order. We don't anticipate that that's going to happen. It's really a standard provision of all of our settlements and modifications. And most importantly, the modification doesn't restrict any further actions that the government or the governments, EGLE or EPA, can take if there are issues that continue. So if we have to go back, and again, we don't anticipate this at all, but if something happens and we've got to do yet another modification or negotiate more requirements, we can still do that. There's nothing in this modification that prevents us from doing that. So this is the modification process. Because this is an ongoing action in the federal court, and the 2015 consent decree was a federal court order, the modification needed to be filed with the court. We called that lodged with the court. And basically what we said to the court is, look, we're going to change, we want to change the consent decree. The court's going to have to approve that change, but don't do anything right now because we're going to accept public comments. In the meantime, in the next 30, it's more like 40 days from the time that we filed it with the court. And then we review the comments, we being the governments, to determine if you know, there are changes to the modification that would be appropriate based on the public comments. And after that review is complete, the governments will either withdraw the modification or will then ask the court to enter it as a judicial order to modify the 2015 CD consent decree. Sorry, I'm using our standard lingo. So that's basically the process. In terms of the timing, it's hard to tell, but as I think was mentioned, the public comment process closes at the end of November. So we'll spend December reviewing the comments. It probably goes into January because of the holidays, and it might also go into January if there's a federal government shutdown. And as soon as we've been able to review those comments, a month, maybe two, if they're extensive comments, we will then file the motion, file something with the court, either saying we need to change the modification or it's all good, just enter it, sign it as a judicial order. So I would anticipate that by February, we will have filed something with the court. And this, you know, these dates can slip again, depending on certain circumstances. And then it's really up to the court. Then, you know, we don't have any control over how long the court will take to review what we've submitted and determine if it's going to approve the modification. So I think that pretty much wraps up my part of this, and I'll turn it over to.
Yeah, thanks, Liz. I appreciate that. Katie, I think that you are up next talking a little bit more about the compliance history, a little bit more about the process and things like that. So go ahead whenever you're ready. I see you're on and it looks like you're unmuted.
Hi, I'm Katie. Good evening and thank you for joining. I am going to provide some more background details to explain how we arrived at the current proposed consent decree modification. So starting in early 2010, when the facility was then owned by Severstal, EGLE and EPA observed numerous visible emission exceedances. These are otherwise known as opacity from the electrostatic precipitator, or ESP. Most of these exceedances were recorded by the continuous opacity monitor that is in the stack. Additionally, through inspections that were conducted by EGLE and EPA and multiple record reviews, we also identified violations related to opacity from other areas of the facility, deficient record keeping, and fallout. So all of these violations were addressed through a 2015 consent decree. And at that time, the site was owned by AK Steel. Just to back up for a second, because some probably are not familiar with an electrostatic precipitator. At Cleveland Cliffs, as Liz already mentioned, it's used primarily to control particulate emissions from the furnaces when making steel. So at a very high level, what happens is electrical fields are used to charge the incoming particles. These particles are coming from the furnaces. There are steel plates inside the precipitator, and those are given the opposite charge. So since opposites attract, the particles attach to the steel plates. Then the plates are knocked or wrapped periodically, so the collected particles fall into a bin and they're taken off site. Okay, there's a lot going on this slide. We wanted to just give kind of a high-level timeline of the major milestones that have happened since 2015. So I already mentioned the original CD that was effective in 2015. That CD mainly required extensive maintenance and repair to the ESP, continued reporting of opacity and investigations into opacity exceedances. So from 2015 to 2019, the company, which was still AK Steel, was complying with the conditions of the decree. However, there was a significant spike in the number of opacity exceedances in the first quarter of 2019. So at that time, the agencies began discussions with AK Steel about ESP replacement. And then later on in 2019, stack testing was conducted that was required by the permit, and it resulted in exceedances of the lead and manganese limits. At that time, it became clear that the existing language in the original consent decree was not going to be sufficient to address these issues. So it needed to be modified. So AK Steel officially became Cleveland Cliffs in February of 2021, and then shortly thereafter, Cliffs began replacement of the ESP. That was in the summer of 2021, and then the whole project wrapped up in March of 2023, as you can see in the timeline. And then there have been 3 stack tests since the project was complete as part of the proposed consent decree terms. And then looking to the future, there are 7 more quarterly tests that are required. All right, so just to give a little more explanation and a visual of the opacity exceedances that I was referring to. So here you can see this is the number of exceedances per quarter as recorded by the continuous monitor that's in the stack. And this graph starts in 2015. So in other words, what's being shown here is that there's an opacity limit in the permit. And then anytime this monitor recorded a value above that limit, it's counted as an exceedance. So in the middle of the graph, you can see the spike. That's the first quarter 2019 that I mentioned in the timeline. And that's, kind of what started the discussions about ESP replacement with the company. Now, a little bit better news is that if you look over to the right side of the graph, you can see the drop off in the number of events since the ESP project was roughly 75% complete. That's that first arrow pointing down. And then you can see how the low numbers of exceedances continued through completion of the project, meaning 100% replacement, and how it's persisted past the replacement date, completion date. So the modification is going to continue to require this data so we can continue to monitor and make sure that those numbers are staying low. All right, this next chart here is going to be the particulate matter stack test results over time. So each one of these bars is a separate stack test of the ESP starting in 2016. And the solid line across at the top of the chart is the permit limit. So as you can see, the permit limit has never been exceeded for particulate matter because none of these bars are crossing that line at the top. What this chart is also showing is the reduction in particulate matter emissions that we saw in the testing that was conducted after the ESP project was roughly 75% complete. So if you can see the July 2022 bar, you see the reduction between the prior test and that one. And then moving forward, you can see that reduction was maintained throughout the testing that's been conducted so far. Here we have the manganese stack test results since 2016. So again, you've got the solid line going across the chart. That's the permit limit. You can see the 3 failures in 2019 that were mentioned in the timeline slide. And this is what led in part to the consent decree modification. Well, this is what led in part to this consent decree modification. And continued the discussions with the facility at that time about ESP replacement. So then we had a pause in time in the testing while the ESP was being rebuilt, and the facility began testing for manganese again in December 2022. And this was after the replacement project was about 75% complete. So since that time, they've passed 3 out of the 4 tests. For the August 2023 test failure, EGLE issued a violation notice. The company has conducted an investigation and provided a response and has included corrective action. They also performed a retest in September of 2023. It was performed under similar conditions as the August test, and the results were in compliance. In addition, because of this proposed modification, the company has to demonstrate ongoing compliance with the limit for at least 7 more quarterly tests. Finally, we have, in terms of stack test, we have the lead test results since, again, 2016. So you can see the solid line representing the permit limit and the 3 failures that happened in 2019. But since the facility began testing for lead again in December 2022, the results have been in compliance. And you can see the reduction in the lead number and the lead value with the test that was conducted once the ESP project was about 75% complete. That's the first bar after the first black arrow. Sorry, that sounded a little bit confusing. And then the reduction continued throughout the testing that occurred after the project was 100% complete and onward. So in addition, the company also has to demonstrate ongoing compliance with this limit for 7 more quarterly tests. So moving forward, EGLE and EPA will continue our routine activities that we conduct to regulate the facility. So this includes conducting on-site inspections, attending stack test, and reviewing the results, responding to complaints, reviewing records, conducting surveillance, and issuing violation notices as warranted. And as it relates to this particular decree, we plan to continue to observe the stack tests that are required, review the results, and review all of the other reporting that is required to be submitted to us through the decree. Finally, there is going to be a SEP that will be carried out, and I'm turning it back over to Jennifer Dixon to kick off that portion of the presentation.
Thank you, Katie. Appreciate you going through all of that stuff. I know there was a lot of data that we just threw at you. So as we move into the question and answer, if you feel like you would like to see one of those charts again, we can definitely pull it up. Might make you a little dizzy, me scrolling back to it and the slides, but I'm more than happy to do that. I'm going to let Karima talk a little bit about the SEPs and the specific SEP in just a second. But first, I wanted to just talk to you about what is a supplemental environmental project, or a SEP as we call it for short. Now, these are a voluntary part of an enforcement action. Like Liz talked about in the very beginning, this is a state-only project for this one. So the feds at the time, it's a little weird, but here's some history for you. At the time, the feds weren't really doing these, EPA wasn't really doing SEPs for whatever reason. Now they're kind of doing them again. We're working on some other projects with them in the Detroit area around this, but at this time they weren't. So we are very, very lucky to have a strong voice in the concerned citizens of South Dearborn. They really felt strongly about doing a supplemental environmental project. And when we do these, what happens is the company voluntarily agrees to do a supplemental environmental project. And that means that money that would normally be paid in a fine is paid into a project that goes back to the community instead of going to the general fund, to the federal or the state general fund. So it's a really nice way for communities to be involved in these enforcement actions. And so we really appreciate, especially when we have strong advocates to kind of run these through, and we definitely did in this case. So these voluntary projects can be a number of different things. So we have actually an interactive map, not an integrated map, an interactive map that shows some different ones and where they've been done over the states, from air filtration systems in schools to tree plantings to more energy efficient lights. It can kind of run a lot of different things. So and you might be able to see on here that this specific project was had to do with air filtration systems in homes, but I am going to let Karima talk more in detail about that. So Karima, I will pass it over to you as soon as you're ready. Go ahead and unmute your mic and take it away.
Hello, good evening, everyone. And thank you, Jennifer. Thank you, everyone, for having me. So I'm Karima Lusha from the South Dearborn community, also a CRSD board member. And I'll be talking about the SEP project granted in this enforcement and the consent decree. So our community represented by the CRSD board had to work with a very limited budget and options to ensure an equitable distribution of a potential benefit that would come out of the SEP, which is granted in the amount of $244,000. With that amount, we wanted, again, to ensure that the benefit or the community members are directly benefiting from that project. So our options came into implementing some kind of air filtering, air purifying devices in the home. So with that, with the stated budget that was provided, there are about 1,203 homes, which give us a $200 for an air purifier that is equipped with HEPA filters. Yeah, some may ask what could have been our other options or the community options. With green belts or planting of trees, the community is already partnered with Friends of the Rouge to bring that pollution mitigation. But again, we're really grateful to have some kind of tangible reward from the SEP or from this enforcement in the form of a SEP that would come back to the community to benefit the community and hopefully, you know, impact their health outcome or improve their health outcome. Also, the SEP has a few portions of, again, as someone has already mentioned, for the industry to replace its old technology to a new technology that would that would mitigate the pollution. So that is already in place, and we're, after the consent decree now, we're working on the community part of the SEP, which is the air purifiers, the community education on how to keep the air purifiers clean and how to maintain them. And that's all from me.
Yeah, thank you for going over that, Karima. I know you had mentioned before the education sessions on the purifiers, and I think at least from one of our other discussions, that's probably going to be a really valuable part of that SEP as well. So thanks for going over that. Appreciate it. I'm sure we'll probably get some questions. And speaking of questions, we are getting to that portion of the evening that if folks have questions, we're happy to answer them. Just as a reminder, I know we do have at least one person calling in, so you can use that question and answer box at the bottom of your screen. Feel free to use the raise hand icon to raise your hand, and we'll unmute your line so you can ask your questions out loud. And if you are calling in, you're just going to press that #2 button on buttons. That would be more than one button, pound and then 2 on your phone, and that will raise your hand for us as well. So panelists, if you want to turn your cameras on again, you can. No problem if you don't want to, but you definitely can right now, and we'll just get to those questions and answers. If folks have them, I'll let folks have a couple minutes here to either raise their hands or put something in the chat. So while folks are thinking about things, I'm going to jump ahead a little bit and just kind of go over some of the details about giving comments. If folks want to, we always say, you know, you can come to these meetings, you can learn things, even if this was a hearing, with this one isn't, but even if it was, sometimes people just aren't prepared to give comments right at that moment. That's why it's really important to just remember that you have a few more weeks to do this. November 29th is going to be the last date. So the way the Department of Justice does their comment periods is they take comments via the mail, just the regular mail. You can put it on a Post-it note, you can type it out, you can write it on a piece of lined paper, whatever you would like to do. And you can send that to the Assistant Attorney Generals at the US DOJ-ENRD. And it's PO Box 7611, Washington, DC. And that zip code is 20044-7611. If I read that too fast for you, no problem. This information will send out to you as well. And then also the public comment email address for them is public comment, one word, or pub comment, one word, -EES.ENRD@usdoj.gov. So I knew if I waited long enough, I would get a question here. So hold on.
Jennifer, this is
Oh, yeah.
Elizabeth. Can I just add something there?
Oh, yeah, sure. Go ahead, Liz. Go ahead.
Sure. So be sure when you submit a comment that you say what the matter is, that it's, you know, to the United States versus Cleveland Cliffs CD modification, consent decree modification. There, if you just Google basically DOJ Cleveland Cliffs consent decree, you should come up with a link that has all this information and has other information that would help you better identify the consent decree. But we at least need to know that this is the Cleveland
At least
Cliffs,
Cleveland
Dearborn
Cliffs, right?
consent decree.
Yeah, that
Yeah.
sounds good. Yeah, thanks for that. So we did get a question. Thanks for that question. Katie, this is going to go to you. So the question was, has Cleveland Cliffs shared any long-term plans beyond these fixes to permanently reduce pollution or upgrade the facility? And we might not know this, but I know with you as being the inspector, you might be privy to some information, or there might have been discussions that you can share. But yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, so I don't have any sort of internal information that's been shared with me about upgrades to the facility. I mean, you know, obviously we're here talking about the upgrade that they just completed about the ESP. But beyond that, usually we find out about these things formally through permit applications. If a facility has a major project they're going to do, that's the route that EGLE finds out about these type of things. And as far as I know, they do not have any permit applications in-house or any that they're preparing to send to us.
Yeah, that's a really good point, Katie, because I think you're right on that. I mean, we always try to encourage companies to, you know, talk to community when they can, share that kind of information. A lot of times, the earlier in the process that that's done, you know, the more questions community might ask, but then also the more that they get answers for. And we've seen that be a very positive relationship between industry and the community that they're in other areas of the state. So we do always encourage that. We also encourage, you know, companies to come in for pre-application meetings. That's like when they might still be in the planning process, so that we can kind of go over some of these things too. So we would encourage the same thing with Cleveland Cliffs here. But yeah, you're right. That's when we typically find out about it. That permitting process is like a company wants to do something that needs a permit. They submit an application, and that's when we find out about it. So really good point there for sure.
I can add to that in terms of like their future plans or, you know, permanent upgrades or anything. The last I heard is with respect to the blast furnace, they're anticipating relining that in the next couple of years. Obviously, that sort of upgrade is not one that is supported by the community. We would support moving to a green steelmaking process. The company has not committed to retiring the blast furnace, and it's similar to the ESP. It's basically prolonging the inevitable. We know that these are technologies that are 100 years old, and rather than relining them or going through consent decree after consent decree, it would be best to just retire them and move to more efficient and green processes. So in terms of just upgrades, that's the one upgrade I know about, is that they're intending on relining it in the next few years. And relining the blast furnace would mean that it would continue to be in existence for another 18 years approximately, as opposed to just retiring it and replacing it altogether.
Yeah, Samra, thank you for talking about that. Interestingly, the question that we got in was literally that question. So if that didn't answer your question, which I think it did, feel free to just send us another one in the Q&A there. But yeah, thanks for bringing that up. I appreciate that. And just so that you know, Samra and Karima, they live in the Dearborn community. And so a lot of times, you're going to hear different things actually living there, being there, than the rest of us would. I mean, Katie is there a lot, but she doesn't necessarily live in Dearborn either. Katie, I don't know, maybe you don't need to say, but I don't think that you do. You live close, but not in Dearborn. So it's definitely one of those things when we have community members, and especially with the CRSD, they're very involved in everything that's kind of going on in this community. So we appreciate that feedback. All
So
right.
I can
Oh, go
answer that
ahead.
question too, because I
Sure.
don't think it was fully answered. I don't know that EGLE is the one that would be able to make the move to going to the green hydrogen DRI, as you mentioned. It is something that we are pressuring GM and other auto industry, utilizers or consumers to tell Cliffs to move in that direction. That is the current thing that we are working on as we speak with Industrious Labs and Mighty Earth regarding pressuring them to go in that direction. So I don't know that EGLE is the one that to make that stuff. I know that we have a participant within this meeting from representing Cleveland Cliffs that can hear your questions and hear our community responses in support of moving to green steelmaking processes and the opposition to the relining of the blast furnace.
Yeah, I think that's a good point too that you bring up. I mean, there's things that community members can do that are a lot different than we can do as EGLE, or that the Department of Attorney General or the Department of Justice can do from a regulatory standpoint. There's a very straight line there that is, we don't go to a company and say, you have to do this with your equipment. That's typically not something that happens unless it's in an enforcement action like this. So if it was just going to be a new permit, we're not involved in helping a company decide what kind of equipment they might need to be putting in. So, think about a company who might need to get like a new emergency engine or something like that to run their process. We're not involved in telling them what engine they might need or how they need to do that or anything like that. They decide, then they submit the permit application, and that's where our kind of authority sort of starts. So thanks for bringing that up too, Samra. I appreciate you giving that perspective. While folks are just thinking of other questions that they might have, I'm just going to go over a couple other things logistically in case it's helpful for people. We talked a little bit about the public comment. So thank you, Liz, for just bringing up, make sure that you mentioned that this is related to the Cleveland Cliffs enforcement case in Dearborn. The more information that you can put in there, the better. So there's other information that you can find on our website, and that's going to be the michigan.gov/EGLE air public notice. You're going to be able to find under enforcement information, the fact sheet, the draft modification, the link to this recording, which again, we will share all of this out to you too. You can also find that on Department of Justice's webpage too. Most people probably had that in their invitation to attend this meeting, but we're happy to provide it to you as well. If you have a complaint or a concern about Cleveland Cliffs or any other facility in the Dearborn area, you can give Katie a call. She is more than happy to take that information to respond. I know she already mentioned this is part of her job as an inspector. We appreciate when people let us know what's going on. Like I said, we're not always there with eyes. People that live in Dearborn, that live near the facilities, they can give us a lot more important information to use to do these complaint investigations. So reach out to Katie if you have those. You can also call our pollution emergency alert system, otherwise known as our PEAS line. And that number is 1-800-292-4706. Definitely use that. I know, Samra, you and I have talked in the past about some issues with the PEAS line. If you ever have an issue with a PEAS line or with a PEAS operator, again, you can let Katie know. Katie will let me know. Me and Caitlin will get that taken care of for you. We also have an online complaint form that you can use as well. You can find that at michigan.gov/air. But again, reach out to us by phone if that's the easiest way to do that.
I would add to that, just if somebody does call into the PEAS line, to always make sure you receive your PEAS reporting number.
Yep, they do a specific number for each call. That is a good way for you to be able to track that back, see what happened with it, see if there was any action taken, see where that was assigned. So yeah, really good point there too. Just like if you call a hotel and you make a reservation, it's almost like your reservation number is how I think of it, but it's a really good thing to just make sure that you're tracking your calls as well. This slide just has everyone's contact information pretty much. You can see Katie, we didn't really hear from Jason, but he's our enforcement person here with our air quality division at EGLE. So definitely reach out to them. Patrick Miller, like I said, he's an engineer from EPA. He's on the panel tonight, but you can also call Dan. He's an engineer too. If you have any questions about this project or how this all came about with the ESP, what is an ESP? How does it work? They're great at kind of talking about that. You can also reach out to Karima or to Samra at their email here for the concerned residents of South Dearborn. They are happy to help you, guide you to some of these resources we've talked about, and or provide other resources that they have, and they're a really great community organization to work with as well. So just kind of checking to see if we have any other questions in the chat, or if anyone raised their hand to ask any. I don't see any right now, but I'll give you just a second here. Okay, yeah, perfect. This is a great question. So we talked about this in the very beginning, but Katie, I'm going to have you just talk about this if you don't mind. The question is the ESP, or the electrostatic precipitator replacement, already complete? Anything that's required related to that under the draft modification to this consent decree? So if you can just talk a little bit about that. I know we'd mentioned it earlier, but if you can kind of go through that timeline of the build there, that'd be great.
Sure. Well, right off the bat, the answer is yes. The ESP replacement is already complete. It was done in stages. The first over 5 stages, and the first stage was completed in June 2021, and then the entire replacement was completed in March 2023. So now the company is in the phase of the very I'm thinking routine, but that's not the word, but an extensive round of testing. As we kind of outlined in the presentation, they've got 9 quarterly tests that they have to do to demonstrate compliance with the emission limits. They've completed 2 of them, and they have 7 more to go.
Yeah, thank you for that. Yeah, I think that's the bottom line. Yes, it's done. I think there was some confusion in the beginning. Some of the early press releases on this comment period and the draft modification didn't really spell it out good, but yes, you're absolutely right. So yeah, and we just got another question about any fence line monitors. Cleveland Cliffs is not planning on installing any fence line monitors that I know of, but Katie, if you have any other information about that, yeah, feel free to share.
Yep, nope, that was going to be my answer. There are no fence line monitors being installed as part of this decree, or any that I know of in general.
Okay, yeah, thank you. All right. Want to make sure I give you guys time just to take a couple minutes here to just want to let you know that it is thundering and lightning at my house. So Caitlin, if something happens and my power goes out, I just want to let you know, you're gonna have to take over. And storms in November, I know it's kind of crazy. Yeah, so Teresa, we're talking about, so her question is, how are we checking to make sure that the ESP is doing what it's supposed to do? And I think Katie just talked a little bit about the performance testing. I know that feels like kind of a weird word, but basically what that is stack testing to make sure that the ESP is controlling the emissions that it's intended to control, right? So we're going to be testing for the next 7 quarters, stack testing. So not just inspections, stack testing of particulate matter, lead, manganese. Am I missing anything?
Yeah, I just want to clarify, it's lead and manganese are going to be tested for the next 7 quarters.
Okay.
Particulate matter is only required for 1 more quarter, but I also want to remind people that particulate matter has never that limit has never been exceeded.
Yep.
We're also going to continue, the opacity monitor in the stack is continuing to operate. And it's continuous. So that's also an indicator of the performance of the ESP.
Yep.
You've already seen a significant drop in the opacity, but we're still within a fairly short window of time. So we're going to keep that thing going and monitoring that those levels stay low.
Yep. Is there any other tests for anything in either a current permit or in this modification for any other stack testing for other things, VOCs, any other toxic air contaminants, any other criteria pollutants like nitrogen oxides or anything
Yes.
like that?
Yes, so there are additional tests. Again, these are pollutants that have not been, they have met the permit limits at the ESP historically, but there is still a testing requirement, not in this consent decree, but it is the testing requirement that's in the renewable operating permit, which is still in effect, in addition to these requirements in the decree. And so there are limits for PM10 and 2.5. NOx, nitrogen oxide, carbon monoxide, mercury. I think that's it. I do not have the table in front of me. No on the hexavalent chromium, Miss Landrum.
Teresa's got the good questions tonight. Appreciate that, definitely. Yeah, so I was just telling Teresa too, like we can share the slides if folks are interested. We'll definitely share those out as well. That might be helpful just to see some of those graphs and not necessarily have to watch it on a screen. So we'll share those out. You should get a follow-up note from Caitlin. She will definitely be sending that out. Is there any like iron oxides? You didn't mention that one, but we can send a list too of the things if that's of interest.
Yeah, no on the iron oxide, and yes, we can send a list.
So we'll try to get that email out in the next, well, we don't have work on Friday. I keep forgetting that. It feels very weird to me not to have work on Friday, and I keep thinking I need to work on Friday. So probably by Monday at the latest, we'll get a follow-up email out to this meeting that will have links to the information. I know folks probably already have it. We'd rather have you have it 3 times than 0 times. So we'll send that to you. We'll send you a link to the recording. We should have that available by sometime on Monday, I hope. And then I'll send you a copy of the slides as well, and any other information that folks have asked for in the meeting tonight. So just waiting for any other questions. Want to make sure that we don't cut anybody off early here either. It's a little bit before 7, so we definitely got a little bit of time. All right, I'm just going to scroll back just to that this slide again, in case anybody wanted to write that down. But like I said, we will be sharing this with you, so you'll have it as well. All right, everybody. Well, I think we're going to go ahead and close the meeting out. Yes, we can definitely repeat the monetary amount of the fine. So when Karima talked, she talked specifically about the amount for the SEP, and is it 244,000, Samra? Okay, good. You're nodding your head. Okay. I was like, do I remember that right? And then was there another additional monetary fine? I'm not sure if we did actually say that.
A little bit over 84,000. Sorry,
Okay.
go ahead.
Nope, you're fine. Jason, do you have the
81,000 is the monetary portion of the penalty.
Okay. All right. The 81,000 comes to EGLE, or it goes to the feds?
It goes to the state general fund.
The state general fund. Yep. All right. Good questions, everybody. Thanks for that. So in this case, and Jason, maybe you can talk to this a little bit.
Yeah, sure. So the way
just
the
make
SEP
sure
policy,
make sure you say the question too, because we're the only ones that are
yeah.
reading it. That's okay.
Ms. Landrum's asking is there any way for that remaining balance to go to the community? And no, the way the SEP policy works is there's always a financial component to the penalty. So there's no way for all the dollars to go into a SEP. There's a minimum penalty. And in this case, we reached the minimum penalty. And that was at $81,000.
Yeah, thanks for that clarification. So can you talk a little bit about when it goes to the general fund, what happens with that money? And I
Well,
don't.
my understanding is
Go
that
ahead.
I mean, it's the general fund and it is spent by the legislature. However, it's sent, however, to, to do the business of the state. That's as far as I know how it goes.
It doesn't come back to Air Quality Division. It
No.
doesn't necessarily come back to,
It's not directed back to here. No.
no. So, yeah, it's kind of a weird thing. And Teresa, I know you probably are aware of some of the legislation that is out there right now, looking at different ways to use those monies. And so, we don't know what the future holds as far as that goes, but yeah, it's definitely something that is of interest usually when we have enforcement actions like this. So there's a question that says, is it valid to put in a public comment that recommends the fine be increased, and what factors would go into that calculation? So you can comment on anything. So these kind of draft modifications, the fine, everything is open for comment. I'm going to let Liz maybe talk a little bit about how that evaluation goes. There's definitely things when it comes to enforcement, it's a little bit different than when it comes to like a permit, an air permit, when we're looking at that. So there's been a lot of back and forth with the company on what happens with the fines, what happens with the penalties, what happens with the actions. So maybe you can talk a little bit about that, Liz, like
Actually,
what happens
Jennifer, in this case, the penalty is all a state penalty.
Oh,
So
okay.
us
All right.
feds
Yep.
were not involved in that because the limits that were violated were only state enforceable limits.
That's
so I think
right. Yep.
somebody from EGLE needs to address that issue.
Apologies. Yeah, Jason, would you be willing to talk
Sure.
about that a little bit?
So the penalty is calculated using the EPA's penalty policy. You definitely can make a comment, but it is generated by the penalty policy. And some of the factors that go into that in this case were how far over the exceedances were over the limits, for how long did the exceedances last. Those are the main factors that go into it. There's several things like an inflation adjustment and other things. And then again, because there was a SEP, part of the penalty amount was set aside for the SEP costs. And then, like I said, we had a minimum penalty that is always part of any SEP project.
Yeah, so when you're looking at that, like in a normal case where a SEP wasn't done, a lot of times, most times, there's not a SEP.
Right.
This is actually a really nice when the community is able to get some of those penalty monies back and put back into the community in all those kind of variety of ways we talked about. So if there hadn't been a SEP with this, they would have just paid more money, that 244 plus 81, which I cannot do that math in my head.
It was
although I don't think
325.
it's
It
okay,
would have been 325.
My brain is not my brain would not do that. And I totally would have said something wrong. But that money would have all went into the general fund. So it definitely wouldn't have benefited the community for sure. And it certainly wouldn't have benefited, the state agency either. So we love when we can get companies to engage with SEPs. Sometimes it makes the enforcement action take longer. It can be like more complicated, but ultimately in the end, it usually ends up being better for the impacted community, for sure. So we really want to, Elizabeth, thanks for that. If anyone's really interested in more about what goes into a penalty, part 55, which is a very rule heavy thing, maybe some reading if you can't fall asleep at night, but it does go into what goes into a penalty kind of unrelated to EPA's penalty policy in general. So there's some, definitely different rules that go into how that is done. It's a pretty prescribed process.
Yeah, Jen, I just wanted to hop in and just say, under Part 55 of the NAREPA, that's the Natural Resources and Environmental Protection Act. So MCL 324.5532, that's the statute, and it lays out the factors to be considered in determining civil fines, whether they're assessed or whether they're agreed to. So that's something to be aware of if you're thinking about that.
That sounds good. Thank you, Elizabeth. Appreciate it. You can tell that she's a lawyer. She was literally like MCL 324. Maybe we can put that in the chat in case people are interested. I think you should, Caitlin might have to do it to put the chat out to everyone, but I think it is interesting and people do like to dig into our rules sometimes. So it would be a good idea to just stick that in there. All right. Yep, there we go. I was pretty impressed with that actually, because I know I wouldn't be able to. I can pull up a lot of air quality rules off the top of my head, but I wouldn't have been able to do that for sure. And Caitlin, I'll let you share that out too. All right. Well, you know, Samara, I know that you guys have been really passionate about what's been going on with this SEP, and I don't know, you know, we don't have a ton of people on. I don't know if we have necessarily a lot of community members on, but I didn't know if you wanted to just talk really quickly before we end the meeting tonight about what the next steps might be for you guys. If, you know, once, let's say that this gets lodged in February, like Liz talked about, are you and Karima and your group kind of going to be thinking about an early spring sort of time frame to start getting the word out about this, or what could people expect, community members expect, if this goes through like we had discussed earlier?
So we've already taken the steps into hiring an intern to kind of compile all of the addresses and then provide different options for the purifiers for the residents to kind of select which would be best, and it would be through the neighborhood association, obviously. And then from there, once hopefully this gets signed, we would take the next steps in speaking to vendors, making sure there's an appropriate inventory. As a part of the SEP, you mentioned that there were educational seminars that we have to do to kind of educate the community about what's coming their way, make sure that people are not turning away shipments that come to their house, make sure that they know how to use it, what it is. And then there's also going to be mailers or flyers that get mailed to the homes, just to kind of front load everyone with what they should be expecting in the mail, and then how to utilize it, and educating them on not just the purifier itself, but on the air quality that has led up to this point, and the enforcement action and everything else that comes with it. So we're going to be doing that blitz hopefully before any shipments actually go out. So if it gets signed in February, we'll start the arrangements on event planning, and then compiling the flyers and the mailers, getting those out in the first few months. And then lastly would be to actually do the shipment of the purifiers, just to ensure that, you know, everybody knows what's coming and they're not turning it away. They know how to use it, you know, et cetera.
Yeah. And I think, so one other thing to mention on that is you guys can't start doing that work until this is signed and lodged and gone through the process. So as of right now, it's not, you know, it's great that the company has agreed to go into the SEP. We have the monetary funds pointed towards this project, but the fact is you can't go forward with it until this is all taken care of. So it's taken a long time. I know you've been working on it for a while. And so thanks for kind of walking us through those next steps. I think having that on this recording could be really helpful for you too. And I know we've talked a little bit about some of the fact sheets and information that EGLE and the DOJ and Attorney General's office did to kind of get ready for this meeting. So if that is helpful for you guys to help get the word out, you know, we're happy to help with that as well. So
I do want to add,
yeah, go ahead.
This is really the SEP, this particular SEP is a real testament to the hard work of the community here, because, you know, a lot of times when you do have SEPs or you have organizations that create these things, there's an administrative cost that's taken right off the top, and there is absolutely none taken by the neighborhood association in this endeavor. In fact, we're kind of coming out of pocket to pay for an intern to get the addresses and the.
Oh, you went on mute for a second. Yep, go ahead. You said you're
so
paying
we're-
an intern. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, we're actually paying the intern to put this all together and do all the work up front. And so if it doesn't get signed, we're actually going to be out of pocket. But we're hopeful that it does go through and that the endeavors pay off, because it's not about money, it's about human lives. And I hope that's something that the corporations can take into account going forward, is that it's not about money, it's about human lives.
Yeah, thank you. I'm gonna let Samra have the last word there. I really appreciate it. Appreciate you and Karima being on with us tonight. I know this isn't a conventional way we do a meeting, so greatly appreciate you guys' participation. Liz and Elizabeth, thank you so much for being participators on this too, and to my EGLE staff. And of course, Caitlin, thank you for helping us out in the background there. So if you want to go ahead and end the meeting, that would be great. I hope everyone has a wonderful evening. And again, thanks so much for participating today.